It's about 5:02. We'll get started in just 2 or 3 more minutes as people join us. But thanks so much for joining us tonight for this really important topic. The Watershed's really excited about the speaker, and I'm sure that we'll all be smarter and better for it after hearing her speak tonight. So thank you for taking the time for this important program tonight. Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this very important program about environmental justice in New Jersey. My name is Jim Waltman, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director at the Watershed Institute. Just a little bit of logistics on tonight's webinar. We are recording the program, and you'll have an opportunity to watch the recording if you'd like after the fact. It'll be emailed out to you. We're also streaming tonight on the Watershed's YouTube channel at the Watershed Institute, and that'll be available on that platform as well. Please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A feature, and we'll be sure to get to you. And so please, we'd like this to be as engaging a meeting as possible. I want to start by acknowledging the land that we're so fortunate to manage here at the Watershed. And we have an unbelievable home, a nature reserve of almost 1,000 acres. And it's important for us to recognize that this land and water that's under our care is the traditional and ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape. We pay respect to Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We respect their knowledge, their culture, and their leadership in the conservation of land and water. The Watershed Institute's mission is straightforward. We work to keep water clean, safe, and healthy, and that means keeping healthy landscapes, working to protect and restore our natural environment. And we pursue this mission through 4 pillars of work that are increasingly integrated, and these include land conservation, advocacy for strong environmental protections, watershed investigations and monitoring, and environmental and STEM education. So I have a great pleasure of working with a team of scientists, advocates, educators, and land stewards, as well as other professionals here at the Watershed Institute. Like many organizations, the Watershed Institute has been on a journey towards embracing the issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We recognize that some of the issues that we work on that are the most pressing issues of water and climate change, issues of flooding, issues of polluted stormwater runoff, lack of tree cover that leads particular communities to be increasingly hot and unbearably so in the summer, But these are issues that are particularly hard-hitting in communities of color that have been systematically left out of the public dialogue, or even worse, purposely discriminated against. So as we've grown sensitivity to these issues, we understand that embracing issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, looking very carefully at where we do the work that we do, that this is intertwined with the issue of protecting water. I'm very grateful that in 2019, staff at the Watershed Institute formed what we call the JEDI Council. This was staff-led, has been, and this group has really helped us chart our journey towards embracing these issues, looking very carefully at the programs that we do and where we do them. The group recently put together this terrific report. This is a report on the work that we've done. Again, we consider ourselves a work in progress, but we're very proud of the work we have done. And I hope you'll all take a look at that report. We'll send a link to you after tonight's webinar. Let's see, before we get started on tonight's speaker, I also want to do a little promotions for some upcoming programs. Coming up on February 10th and February 17th, we're holding our annual Watershed Conference. This will be a hybrid format, so you can come in person or you can tune in on the great Zoom machine that we love so much and are enjoying this evening. But we're excited about this conference. It's going to be really focused on the issues of flooding and protecting water and how we work together, work within regional context to address these pressing issues. And the conference this year has 3 tracks for implementers, policymakers, and community members. So there'll be discussions and learning on these issues really at all levels. Registration you can do online here at the watershed.org, and we do ask that you register before February 6th. We're very excited that the keynote speaker for our conference this year is Candace Perry. Candace is the director of the Office of Environmental Justice at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Our next Watershed Wednesday webinar is coming up on February 22nd. That'll be a fireside chat with Sue Inches on environmental advocacy and storytelling, and we know that'll be a great event as well. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Anna Baptista is an assistant professor of professional practice in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management program at the New School in New York City. She also serves as the co-director of the Tishman Environmental and Design Center at the New School. See, Dr. Baptista's professional practice is focused on advancing environmental justice through collaborative work with communities on issues ranging from cumulative impacts, climate justice, and zero waste. Her current research and practice includes the launch of a National Environmental Justice Movement Fellowship, helping to advance state-level EJ policies and national climate justice policies, as well as best practices for local land use and planning. Dr. Baptista also serves on the Board of Trustees for the Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark, the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, and the Victoria Foundation. So obviously she's very busy, and we're very fortunate to have her with us this evening. She was also appointed to the 4th New York City panel on climate change and is an inaugural member of the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. She's truly a key architect of New Jersey's environmental justice law and policies and practices, and we'll all learn from her tonight. Leading the conversation, I'm delighted to introduce also Stephanie Silva. I will call Stephanie one of the true rising stars at the Watershed Institute. We're very fortunate to have her on our staff. She's also a great example, a great success story. She started with us as an intern in 2017, went off to work as a STEM teacher at the Liberty Science Center for a few years, and we're so lucky to have her back. She came back to the Watershed and is a key member of our education staff since October 2021. I'll say that Steph has been a key designer and implementer of our education programs for schools in the city of Trenton, the town of Heightstown, and it is a key leader of our Jedi Council. So again, Steph, thank you for the work that you do for the Watershed. You are making us a better and stronger organization. I'm going to turn it over to Steph, and this is really going to be a conversation tonight. This is not going to be a lecture. So you'll hear from Dr. Baptista and Steph in a very conversational manner. So welcome to you both. Thanks again, and please enjoy tonight's program. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Jim. Again, I want to welcome Dr. Baptista, and thank you for joining us for this very important panel. So I guess we'll just start with the first question that we had prepared for you, and that is, how do you define environmental justice?
It's a tricky question, Steph, because it seems like an easy question, right? But I spent like a whole semester teaching it, so I can tell you it's a very layered answer. So it's tough to answer in like my elevator pitch of what's environmental justice and how do you define it. Well, I'll tell you some of the basics of how I start this conversation about environmental justice with my students. And I teach a class on environmental justice at the new school. And usually we start with, often describing what environmental justice is not. So many times if I say, what's environmental justice? They might say, it's, communities of color, indigenous communities, low wealth communities that are disproportionately burdened by pollution. And I'm like, that's the opposite of environmental justice, right? That's environmental injustice or environmental racism. But much harder is to actually articulate what environmental justice would look like. And really the most simple way, the way I would explain it to my parents, or the way my parents explained it to me, is everybody has the right to a healthy and clean, dignified place to live and work and play and go to school and thrive, really, not just survive, but thrive. And that freedom to be in communities that are healthy and safe is unfortunately not the reality for many of our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other communities, low wealth communities, not just here in the US, but around the world, obviously, in the global South as well. And the definition gets, we can get really technical, like the way we think about sometimes environmental justice, or folks have broken it down, often is through different dimensions of environmental justice, just like we have different dimensions of social justice, racial justice, right? You all have been working on your JEDI report, so you've probably explored this issue in some depth, right? Trying to understand, what do we mean by social justice? What are the norms and values that we hold as a society about what we think is just and fair and right? And sometimes we can think of it in terms of distributive justice, right? Like this idea that some communities are asked to bear or forced to bear the burden, like a disproportionate burden of pollution, right? Of the things that nobody wants. And so we sacrifice these communities, we call them sacrifice zones, and we dump on them and exploit them, right? So there's a sense of that there's a distributive problem, but then if we dig deeper, there's more to it, right, than just distribution, because if we just redistributed the bad stuff, would that make it okay? Right? Like maybe if we go deeper, we start to ask, well, what's the procedural justice, or the justice in how our society comes to understand what is a good life? Like, what are the benefits and burdens that we want to share? And who gets to have a say in that, right? Who has the power and the decision-making power to, really affect the conditions of your life, right? And so sometimes people talk about that as like, fairness of processes, of decision-making, of governance, right? Democracy. And then there's even deeper forms of, we get into more other forms of justice, like recognition, right? How do communities that have historically been marginalized and pushed into the subaltern or into being invisibilized and exploited in a society, if you're not recognized as a full member of that society, it's hard to gain justice, right? And we can see that in the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ plus movements, right? The right of your identity and your personhood and your community to be recognized in a society makes it possible for you to be part of distributive justice or procedural justice. So there's lots of different layers to like, what do we mean by environmental justice? And for me, like to achieve environmental justice, you kind of have to have all of those elements, right? The conditions that make it possible for us to live fully realized, dignified, and thriving lives.
Thank you for making that distinction, because I feel like, oftentimes you think of environmental justice, you think of the injustices, and that was very well put, how you distinguish that. So what brought you to this work in environmental justice?
Yeah, I know you said you grew up in Jersey City. I grew up in Newark. My family immigrated to the city of Newark from Portugal, so we are arrivants in settlers on Lenni Lenape lands, right, in Newark, and we came as refugees of the fascist regime of in that country, and really tried to create a community. There was already a strong community in Newark of Portuguese and Latinx and folks from all over the global South, also in Newark today, as well as African American communities. And so we joined sort of that community of both immigrants and African Americans, very rich cultural diversity and racial diversity in Newark. And it was a wonderful place to grow up in Newark, but it was also very eye-opening, right? To grow up as a kid in a place. I was only 3 blocks from, the state's largest garbage incinerator. And I remember when it wasn't there. So my family was really literally on the fence line and the front lines of a lot of the industries. We lived on like the easternmost edge of the Ironbound community in Newark, which is in the East Ward of Newark. So it's very, very industrialized. And we watched factories be abandoned and new factories be built. And my own family was organized by community organizers in the Ironbound Community Corporation, who knocked on our doors and encouraged us to come to meetings in the evenings and really fight and protest against the continuous dumping in the community of more and more garbage and just industries. So as a kid, I didn't understand that was environmental justice. You just kind of like, that's what was happening. And I was actually going along just to translate. I was a bad translator. I don't know if my parents got half of what was going on. But then later, as I became a teenager and I left Newark to go to school, it really affected it shaped my thinking, and really, honestly, it made me really angry. And that anger fueled me to be like, why is our communities being so dumped on? And so I wanted to become a scientist. I was going to become an environmental scientist. I studied science, and then I eventually came back home and did a doctorate in urban planning, so that always with the intention in the back of my mind to come back home and to try to like make things better. And so, yeah, that really shaped, that experience of growing up and being of Newark really shaped my thinking about EJ.
That's so cool that you were kind of brought into it as a young child, and that it had carried on with you to the rest of your life and your career. So what is kind of like the history of the environmental justice movement in New Jersey?
Yeah, that's a great question, and several of like the OGs, I call them the OGs, the elders of the movement in New Jersey. Unfortunately, we're losing many of them now, and I know myself and the EJ leaders in New Jersey really want to try to capture some of those oral histories and those stories of early organizing in the EJ movement in New Jersey before it's too late. So we definitely want to do that. But I came in sort of relatively a little bit, maybe in the 2000s, I came back home, but it was already like EJ movement was, well underway in the 70s and 80s, even before people were calling it the EJ movement. There were folks organizing in places like Trenton, Rahway, Newark, Camden, all over New Jersey, mostly in the cities, but not exclusively in the cities. There were farm workers organizing in South Jersey for sure for a long time. So those struggles in the local communities in the cities throughout New Jersey, especially around the industrial corridor, were always they're sort of a constant, and they weren't considered environmental fights. Those were considered urban problems. Yeah, and at the time, many of those fights were very localized struggles. I think when I came in 2000, in the early 2000s, there were several groups or individuals like Valerie Caffey, Ted Carrington. These are folks who are members of the NAACP. They were members of the Work Environment Council. They were, members of local civic groups like in Long Branch and in obviously Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark. In Camden and South Camden, Waterfront South, there were groups that came together and they were planning and organizing their attendance at the second National People of Color Summit. And it was sort of another watershed opportunity for all of these organizers and activists around the state to gather together and plan a New Jersey delegation to the second National People of Color Summit. I think it was it in 2002? I can't remember. But yeah, so that's when I came in. I was in graduate school at the time. I was just a student and I just volunteered and started really coming into the formation of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, which for a decade, from the early 2000s, for over a decade, was really a coalition of groups and individuals. And now we're, a nonprofit and we have staff and it's amazing. And EJ now is, everybody's doing EJ. EJ's sexy now, but I guarantee you back in the day, nobody wanted to touch environmental justice, or they would be like, what's that? Like, what is, but it's I think it's a great story, a rich story that we should probably try to piece together from the people who were part of it.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned that, like, maybe like these like environmental concerns maybe felt more like, oh, those are urban issues. So the things that just exclusively happen there, but like that has nothing to do with the greater environment. You can also often feel like living in a city, like you're like kind of like displaced from anything that is considered the environment. That's kind of what brought me to this work that I do, I have a off-script question. So these local struggles that are going on within the community, do you find that that they are within the boundaries of the community or it's from neighboring communities? Like, how do you navigate issues of environmental justice in a community with issues that are not originating in that community? Like, is it more difficult to get community support when you have to advocate at a neighboring community that is causing the pollution? In those cases, pollution being caused somewhere else, leading to issues here. Is it better to look towards the county and state for solutions, or are there examples where neighboring cities have helped reduce these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because oftentimes we think of these problems as very like isolated problems, right? Oh, you have an industry here and the pollution is here, but that's not really the reality, right? A lot of times, you take a place like Newark, for example, you have many of the polluting facilities are regional facilities, right? Like the garbage incinerator takes trash from 48 municipalities and New York City, right? So they take trash from a huge waste shed. The same thing with the sewage treatment plant or highways, warehousing. These are all like regional infrastructures that serve sometimes the whole metropolitan area, sometimes like that region that they're in, or neighboring towns. And we, the way that environmental laws are set up, it makes people think like, oh, this is Newark's problem, right? But the reality is, take something like garbage. Most of our environmental problems are, if you look at the root cause, we all have some skin in the game, even though the people who are bearing the brunt of the burdens are the people that are in close proximity, or the people that probably and oftentimes have the least amount of responsibility for producing that problem, like low wealth people, low income households, people of color. So that's true of climate change, that's true of waste production. And so we can't, for example, we can't solve a problem like, waste, garbage disposal, or climate change by only dealing with the problem, like in the places where the dumping and the sacrifice zones are, right? Places like in Newark that are sacrificed don't exist without a relationship to the region, right? To the whole, because it's that city of Newark is basically serving as a sink for the rest of the region's services. For you to have an airport and a seaport that ships all your goods that you're consuming, or for you to have a place to flush your toilet and send it to, places like Newark exist in relationship to the surrounding suburbs and the metropolitan region. And so to solve for those problems, they can't be solved by Newark. They have to actually be solved. And the bulk of the responsibility actually falls well outside of Newark. It falls with solidarity and work that has to be done across the county, across the region, sometimes across the states, right? And in some cases, even globally, right? Because a lot of what we do also gets exported to the global south, and impacts them. So we have to be really mindful, if we care about environmental justice, about how, I have a lot of my students focus and almost like fetishize the EJ communities. And I'm always like, turn your gaze towards the suburbs, towards the rural counties, towards the areas that surround EJ communities, because they're implicated in the creation of these spaces. And yet we rarely pay any attention to them, how those communities are formed, how they're organized, and how they work in relationship to EJ communities, right? What is our obligation as communities to each other? So I very much think that there's an important role for working at the state, at the regional, at the bio-regional, metropolitan, and even at the global level, right? If we really care about EJ, we do have to have some consciousness about those different scales of collaboration and solidarity.
So New Jersey recently passed in 2020 an environmental justice law. How will that law have an impact on our EJ communities?
It will have a big impact. It is a law that basically does what EJ groups have been asking for decades around the country, not just in New Jersey, but New Jersey is the first place where we've been able to pass a law and codify it in rulemaking that basically says if you're a major facility that is seeking a permit, like an incinerator or some other kind of major industry that has some pollution, that if you're locating in a community that's already overburdened, and your contribution, your activity in that census block group that's overburdened already, if you have any contribution that will add, what they call cause or contribute to public health and environmental stressors, the state must deny that permit. And that's a very big step, because in the past, the state said, we don't have the legal authority to say no, even when we know they're contributing to these disproportionate cumulative impacts. We just don't have the legal authority. Well, this law changes that. It says, actually, not only do you have the authority, but you're mandated to actually deny permits on the basis of cumulative impacts. And really importantly, the state of New Jersey developed a really creative, innovative approach to looking at stressors. They can combine 23 stressors. They did this very comprehensive map of the state. And we have a very clear path to understanding cumulative impacts using those stressors. And the environmental justice community were very much part of those conversations with the state regulators to develop that tool and those mechanisms, because the devil's always in the details, right? Like the law is great and everybody's like, yay, we passed the law. But then the hard work comes 2 years later, developing the rules and the technical guidance for how you're actually going to implement this very complicated law. So that's been a very big part of the work that EJ groups like Ironbound Community Corps, New Jersey EJ Alliance, and Clean Water Action have been doing together with the New Jersey DEP for the past couple of years. So it's been a labor of love, but I have to tell you, it's we're talking to people all over the country. New York State just passed a similar bill based on, modeled after the New Jersey law. Washington State is putting out their law. There are at least a dozen states and they call us constantly, the EJ groups and the legislators there, because there's this momentum and interest. Now that New Jersey's done it, it's sort of opened the floodgates for other states wanting to follow suit. So it's been really wonderful to see the power of that.
Yeah. We have some questions from our Q&A, and this is back on the topic of incinerators. So someone says, a friend of mine has some experience with an incinerator, and it might be in Newark. And from her perspective, incineration seems like a better solution than landfills when it comes to waste. Can you speak on how incinerators or other large-scale waste treatment play a role in environmental justice or injustice?
Yes, a favorite topic of mine. I've become it's funny, I did a report back in 2019, a national study of municipal solid waste incinerators in the United States. And we looked at the economics and the environmental impacts of incinerators. And what we found is that 80% of incinerators are located in communities of color and low-income communities, which is not a coincidence that that co-location exists. And we found that economically, incinerators are very bad for communities. They actually have bankrupted several communities or come close to bankrupting. Places like Detroit and Chester, Pennsylvania, and many others, where they incur huge amounts of public debt and end up costing taxpayers a tremendous amount of money. So very economically, not a good, very risky proposition. And then they're only profitable at very large scales. So in order for incinerators to be profitable, they need to handle very large volumes of waste. So what we found is in communities and regions where incinerators are present, that actually recycling and diversion to composting drops dramatically, because there's no longer any incentive to reduce waste volume, because there's a built-in requirement for facilities to operate at capacity. They need large volumes of waste. That's true also in Europe and China, where they've tried to, they've relied on incineration for decades and are realizing that as they get good, as societies get good at recycling and diversion, they no longer have the waste volumes to burn. And then the last thing I'll say, which is the most important thing, is that incinerators are actually really harmful to public health and human health and the environment. Actually, Zero Waste Europe just put out a study, a multi-year study looking at biomarkers of toxics from incinerators. Incinerators are much more prevalent in Europe. So they have longitudinal studies about the presence of dioxins, nanoparticles, PFAs, PFOAs, mercury and lead that are contaminating soils and actually entering people's bloodstream. And they're finding all sorts of health issues, both maternal and low birth weights. So there's lots of public health concerns. In the US, what we found as incinerators are the largest sources of mercury and lead, and often some of the largest point sources of criteria air pollutants like NOx and SOx and particulate matter, all of which cause significant harm to public health. So I don't fall into the trap of landfills versus incinerators. They're both not good, but I will tell you that incinerators are much worse for environmental justice than landfills, actually, because of the economic and environmental model that they propose. So yeah, and I can send a lot of good resources if people want to learn more and educate themselves more about waste issues and the alternatives to both incineration and landfilling. Gaia is a great resource, and I can put that in the chat for people to explore on their own.
Thank you for that. I would be interested in that, because that was pretty informative. I had no idea the economics behind running an incinerator, and yeah, it seems like it's something that is phasing out as you said, people get more responsible with their waste. Another question regarding back to the environmental justice law. Were there things that were left out in the law that should still be considered and advocated for?
That's a great question. The law, we really see the EJ law as one part of a much bigger puzzle, right? So the EJ law does not solve the environmental injustice problems in New Jersey. Really, it actually takes a very minimal step, because in most cases, it's addressing new pollution sources. So it just like stops the exacerbation of environmental injustice. I mean, it goes part of the way towards mitigating existing pollution, because it does apply to renewals of permits, but it can only go so far, right? It's not going to get rid of what's there already. It's just going to maybe try to ratchet down some of the pollution through renewals over time. So there's a lot more work we need to do, right, in terms of environmental justice, like things like building up our climate resiliency, right, in our green infrastructure, and investing in communities of color and low-income communities that have, been sacrificed, developing new regenerative economic models, right, that can provide pathways for the future for communities that are not polluting. And there's a lot of work we need to do in the transportation sector. For example, the law doesn't talk at all about the transportation sector. Everybody's excited about electric vehicles, but in the city of Newark and Trenton and Camden, other places, we rely on public transit and pedestrian and bike access, which is really important, much better than private vehicles, right? So we need to invest in public transit and clean public transit, right? Affordable housing, like sustainable affordable housing. So there's all sorts of tasks we still have to tackle. And one of the big priorities for the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance in the next year is also looking at this thing called mandatory emissions reductions. Dr. Nikki Sheets is leading that effort at the state and at the federal level, looking at how we can target climate mitigation to power plants in the fossil fuel sector, a lot of which is located in EJ communities, at least in New Jersey, and how we can start ratcheting down pollution in that sector, in the power sector.
What needs to happen to get people from the suburbs or, people who aren't in EJ communities to care more about the impacts on these disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I'd like to put the question back.
Yeah.
Well, right. I think it's a point of reflection for all of us that do this work and that care about environmental justice. How do we inspire and motivate collective action and solidarity? And I don't really have the perfect answer. I like to think of building relationships of care, right, where people feel connected, where they feel like they're not just isolated in their little suburban home, but that they're part of a larger community. And the more people feel connected and feel like they have relationships outside of just their isolated bubble, they're more likely to get activated and participate and care if they're networked, if they're part of a collective or a community outside of their household. So yeah, places like the Watershed Institute or, civic spaces, our faith-based communities, places where people gather and where we can organize. I think that's where we're going to reach people, honestly, and hopefully help people connect the dots and figure out, okay, if I'm part of a group of people that lives in the suburbs surrounding Newark, how can I be part of the solution? What can I be contributing where I'm situated? And so, you can't do it alone in isolation, but I think these are the good spaces to raise those questions, right? How do we reach our neighbors and our friends? Yeah, so I'd love to hear ideas from the group. Actually, you probably have a good group here that can brainstorm some ideas for that.
It seems like there needs to be some kind of like culture shift from, between thinking like, that's their problem. It's happening in, in their neighborhood, and that's not our problem. We're good here. We have to act as a whole on many issues, not just, this topic of environmental justice. There are many questions coming through the chat right now, so I just want to see. So, Dr. Baptista, your family had been involved in environmental justice. Are they still involved, or what are they up to, or are they still in Newark? Or
they're still in Newark, in the house they grew up in the same neighborhood, and it still smells like 4 days out of the week. So I've taught my 80-year-old mother how to do odor complaints, which is not the thing. My mother doesn't speak English very well. So I'm like, you could just dial this button and then you could tell them, and she speaks Portuguese, but I'm like, just tell them in Spanish. So that's been fun, training my elderly parents how to do odor complaints. But yeah, so we're still in the community. I'm still very much there. Even though I don't live in Newark anymore, but my parents are still there and still very active, right? My family still comes from a time where your neighbors, everybody, not that everybody's business, but the people on the block and the people that live in your house, and you take care of each other, you look out for each other. If you need somebody to watch your kid or go pick up your kid at school, my mother's 82, but she's still very much doing that, and I think, we've lost a little bit of that community sense of we're part of something bigger, right? We don't just, like you said, we don't just care about ourselves and our own kids, but we care about other people's kids and what's happening in the neighborhood. We're looking out for one another. So yeah, so my parents are still there, still dragging me out to meetings, and now I return the favor and drag them to meetings, but they tell me, they're like, we're tired, like it's you now, it's your now I drag my kids to stuff. And I'm like, no, it's your turn to like get in the groove and get in the mix. And I think that's good, like having this intergenerational passing on of knowledge, and seeing that it's part of our work, right? It's not just what we do at work 9 to 5, but it's part of being part of a community. Is showing up, going to late night meetings at the planning board, or coming to the protest. When people in Newark call me and it's like, there's something we're going to protest, the sewage treatment plant, I'm going to be there. My kids are going to come. Like, we're going to show up and be present, and that's what we need. That's what solidarity is, right?
That's awesome. I love to hear that you're getting your kids involved in advocacy as well. Being that I do that.
Kids love a good protest. There's nothing like getting a kid involved in a protest. All of a sudden.
I also love to argue.
Yes, right?
I've done many mock town halls with students, and they love to argue.
Tell them we don't need to mock. They can come to real live like hearings and argue for real.
Yeah.
We'll put them to work.
So what are your priorities for the next 3 to 5 years in terms of like environmental justice in New Jersey?
Well, you heard we are working on this, like the power sector, right? Like there's a lot going on the energy side of things, like renewable energy, like what's that going to look like in New Jersey? How do communities of color and low income communities not become the passive like afterthought to that, right? But actually are central leading voices in accessing the benefits of renewable energy, right? Whether that's manufacturing and production or consumption, energy efficiency programs, installation, we need to be really in the mix on energy, and also fighting false solutions. There's a lot of proposals that are coming out of this large federal investment in the IRA funding that is actually very worrisome, because there's some backsliding into things like natural gas and investing in risky things like hydrogen and things that don't hold as much promise as potentially solar or wind or other solutions that we can put forth together. So we always have to be on the lookout, because while we are trying to fight for environmental justice, there are people who are more than happy to co-opt the moment and the resources and greenwash it and make it seem like, oh, this is progress, but really it's just the same old stuff repackaged. And so the EJ community has always had a very critical analysis of what does real renewable energy look like. Let's get real. What are the real benefits and burdens? Who has access to this? Who benefits from this? So, those are, I think, important voices in the mix.
Thanks for that. So I have another one. What data points can we use to most quickly demonstrate the urgency of environmental justice and its impact on people's lives to capture the attention of people who aren't doing enough?
I don't know, I'm going to push back a little bit on the urgency or the data points. I think, we're doing this big project right now with a national organization called the Climate Justice Alliance. And it's all around metrics of impact, to really try to surface and make visible to people how grassroots environmental justice-led solutions actually have much more transformative impact that is sometimes not legible to the average person. And so that project is really important, but we often get caught in this trap of this notion of urgency. Urgency has, climate change and environmental racism. This has been around for a long time. And yes, there's an urgency for us to deal with it just because of the realities of the timing, right? We've run out of time. In many communities, it's already too late. But the urgency can't be the excuse for doing more damage, or kind of trampling over good relations and good process. Because if we're not in right relationship with each other, if we're not learning and listening to the front lines, and to folks who are really living the crisis, and then we may end up doing more harm than good, actually. So sometimes I feel that at the university, it's like, oh my God, we gotta do everything about the climate change. And I'm like, wait, let's listen to people that are, actually living that crisis. Let's pay attention to their leadership. Let's listen to their voices and center their voices. And sometimes you have to slow down to do that. Sometimes you have to slow down to hurry up. You know what I'm saying? So I agree, there is an urgent moment, and it's been here for a long time, but we have to move in right relationship to one another, right? And to get there, we have to build trust. We have to build a sense of mutuality and solidarity. We have to be humble, we don't know everything. We always have stuff to learn from each other. And EJ communities are doing a lot and are leading quite a bit in the state. So let's give them some, let's support them, right? To be an ally is also to be a co-conspirator. Sometimes it's I'll be on call, call me when you guys, need me, or, let's co-conspire. How can we work together to support the advancement of your goals? So, getting into formation like that is important too.
Yeah. Their urgency sounds like it needs to happen right now, and that it'll be done in a couple of years. But this is a long-term kind of thing that we have to continue to work on, because as you said, there are some communities that it's already too late. And yeah,
you did that Jedi work, so sometimes.
yeah. So someone asked, Food and Water Watch and Clean Water Action are two of the many groups that make it possible for people in the suburbs to volunteer to oppose environmentally racist conditions. What other groups do you recommend to get involved with, I guess, people
to volunteer? I would definitely check out New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, njeja.org, Ironbound Community Corps, ICC, ironboundtc.org. There's also a group called the South Ward Environmental Alliance in Newark, SWEA.org, SWEA.org. So all of these groups are doing great work. And there's I'm sure lots of others I'm forgetting, but honestly, tapping into the listservs or the social media of a lot of these groups, you'll get updates or social media posts on Instagram or Facebook or different places, or get on the listservs so that you can kind of hear there's a petition right now you can sign on to, or how can you get involved. So I definitely encourage people to get on a New Jersey EJ Alliance's listserv and keep up to date with ICC's postings, because they often do put out a call for getting involved, in addition to obviously Clean Water and Food Water Watch, great groups. So yeah, there's lots of different groups you can plug into.
Thank you for sharing all those.
And Gaia too, I'll put that in the chat too. The Gaia is no-burn.org. So they're another great resource if you're interested in, if you're a waste geek like me, they've got great resources.
So with all the things that we spoke about, how are you hopeful that, some of these issues are going to be addressed, and what brings you hope to continue doing this work?
Honestly, like my own community, like, is seeing residents in Newark and seeing my kids and residents, in communities that continue to like do the hard work of showing up and organizing, even though they're dealing with like a million other things in their lives. And they continue to show up for their communities and to organize for their, their own community. So I think that's inspires me. It's like, if groups on the front lines that are the most impacted haven't given up, I can't give up, right? Because I sit in a privileged position, right? I sit and I have this job at a university, so if they don't give up, I can't give up. And those communities, we need all of us to be in the fight. If those of us who are more comfortable and more privileged just sit back and are passive observers, then we're complicit, right? And so we need to add our energy and our hearts and minds to the effort in some way, they're small or big. So I feel like those things give me hope, because our communities are still fighting, and they're going to keep fighting. So, we got to keep fighting too.
We appreciate you for continuing to do all the work you do. And there's plenty of people in this call right now that are eager, as I can see, to do some work as well. And some are asking, do you know of any EJ organizations in the Trenton area?
This is a good question for the New Jersey EJ Alliance. I know they're working with groups our folks in Trenton, Galway, but lots of different places. So you should reach out. I think the staff emails are on the website, so you could like email them and send an inquiry about that. Awesome. I don't want to like say a group in there. I don't know.
Okay. Information is power. You're getting a lot of acknowledgements as well in the question and answer section. Lots of thank yous for the work you do. And again, many people wanting to get involved. The Watershed Institute, we educate students and community members and senior citizens who want to get involved in advocacy in the environment. And many of them are interested in environmental justice. And if you can just share any more like advice on how we can connect them to the movement, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, I mean, young people are hot. It's like that's a great group to work with. They're energized and excited, and sometimes way more sophisticated in terms of their analysis. I know when I was a kid, I was like, oh, I wasn't thinking like that. I was a little bit clueless. But now, like, kids have a much sharper analysis, a much quicker analysis sometimes than we give them credit for. And maybe if we can do some more political education with kids too, I think they're hungry for that sort of thing, and could be really powerful in the development, in their own development, in whatever field they go into. So I think it's an important part of the formation of the next generation, and like the pipeline of activists that we need to really invest in. So I think it's great that you're doing that in your space stuff. It's important that we do that in all the spaces that we're in. I know, that's part of my mission as a professor, right, is to sort of try to form the next generation of folks that are going to be out in the world, hopefully working collaboratively on environmental justice, whether it's in their own communities or in other professional sectors. So having a critical analysis of the world, right? Really trying to think deeply and critically about, what is business as usual, and how am I going to like bring my own analysis of power relations, social justice, what I know about social justice and the world, and placing all of those values sort of at the center of our work. So yeah, I think it's super important. We can, and nowadays it's like important we do education. I'm sure you probably have a lot more experience about how to bring it to life. You know, when I was a kid, you know, learning about the environment was like pandas and tree, I don't know, like it was totally divorced from like my lived experience. And now, you know, I feel like there's a lot more attention to experiential learning, right? Like connecting people where they are. Like everything is the environment, like all, you know, where we live and work is environment, and we can learn from all of these spaces, and not just like the pristine nature out there, like bringing that closer to home to our lived experiences, and empowering youth who may otherwise be disaffected, right? Like, and feel divorced from any sense of connection to place. So I think that's really important, is to, you know, help kids feel that sense of attachment to community.
Yeah, agreed.
I'm sure you have a lot more insight about
But
that.
yeah, my favorite thing to do is, you know, when teaching about watersheds, is to show that image of the water cycle that is just like a mountain with, like, you know, a river and the ocean, and like, what is that? Like, where is that in the world? Like, that doesn't, I don't know, that doesn't connect to me. And to teach about a watershed, you really have to include all the people. Like, we're part of that. We're part of the watershed. We're part of, you know, we impact the water. And, you know, showing them a picture of Trenton, that is also a watershed. And all those things are still happening. You know, it doesn't have to look like a mountain with a glacier on top and all these picturesque, nice things. Like, it's still a watershed. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So like, what is one of the main things you try to teach your students in your course? Not trying to ask for like an audit of your course, but
I know. You should ask Sophie, right? She took my class. We should quiz her. You know, I think sometimes the most important thing to learn is to listen, right? And to be like a humility, you know, like in our learning, that, and to understand we all have something to contribute to learning. Like, we're all learning together. We're creating a learning community. I bring my experiences and life experiences to the table, and what I've learned from that life. But everybody has something that they're contributing in that space. But also, you know, I'm not trying to teach you to be, you know, a savior. Like, you're not going to go out there and fix things, right? You're, you know, if you're a good student and really hope to make change in the world, you have to also learn how to listen, how to be humble, how to share your skills and your insights as part of a collective. Yeah, so, you know, those are some of like the, you know, if you learn nothing else, I want to make sure that my students don't go out into the world sort of trampling all over or parachuting into things like, I'm the expert, I know everything, I went to grad school, look at my degree. No, like, you should leave school with more questions than answers, right? And you know, trying, you know, still being curious and being an active listener, and you know, being willing to take some risks and oh, did you lose power? What?
we were sitting still too long.
The lights are like, no more lights.
So I have I don't know how much time we have for questions. Are we till 6:15? I don't know. 6:30. Cool. Okay. So got plenty of time. All right. So there's one that was quite popular in the Q&A Can environmental fields such as those clean energy or park and recreation better attract support and employ community members who are from emerging communities?
Yeah, I mean, that's like old new ideas, right? Like we, like the big thing now is green reindustrialization. Like, you know, it used to be green jobs, green infrastructure jobs, like all of those things. I think the key is like, what is the regenerative work that's gonna give people access to like a dignified living wage, right? Not just a living wage, but a dignified wage that, you know, is tied to like care work, regenerative work, work that builds our communities up rather than like polluting them, right? So all of those things are important, and there's certainly lots of possibility, right? And like growing our own food and building our green spaces, and how can we, you know, build renewable energy like microgrids. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about battery storage and solar panels and, you know, all sorts of endeavors, you know, cleaning up our waterways. You know, we're gonna have the Passaic River behind me in the picture, and there's going to be a big cleanup of that river. How are our residents participating in that cleanup? It's going to be over a decade of cleaning up. It can't, you know, shouldn't just be, you know, strangers. You know, how can our community get involved in that restoration work and benefit from it? So yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities. I know the big infusion of money from the IRA and the IIJA, whatever the infrastructure package, promises to infuse more money, more dollars to the state and local levels. But you know, there's got to be a lot of input, like local input and oversight. Like it's, you know, that money won't just magically appear in the right places. Like what needs our advocacy. Like we need to start asking our legislators at the state and at the municipal level, like where is funding coming into the state? You know, how is it being distributed? What's it being used for? So we need some watchdogging and advocacy around that funding so that we make investments that can produce those opportunities.
Yeah. This was an interesting question. Should environmental justice be considered for environmental living things, such as trees, wildlife, and biota in general, because we all rely on them?
Are you asking, is that part of environmental justice? I think that's the question.
Yeah, are trees and wildlife and
non-human nature is definitely part of environmental justice, and many communities like indigenous environmental justice groups constantly remind those of us who come from more urban settings that actually we have to be in right relationship with our non-human you know, ecological systems, you know, all the biota, all the
trees especially.
Yeah, living and non-living things are relations, right? Are sacred relations for some indigenous people, but also definitely the lifeblood of, you know, that's why water is life, right? Is part of that mantra. So definitely environmental justice extends to ecological justice and human and non-human justice, right? What is the relationship between humans and non-humans? So it's not just an anthropocentric, you know, or human-centered justice by any stretch. And we have a lot to learn from indigenous communities about how to be in right relationship with non-human living and non-living biota. You know, in some countries, like they're giving personhood to like rivers and ecosystems, to watersheds, to mountains, and as an extension of the indigenous cultures and cosmovisions, right? How they view the world is that there's actually, those are kin relationships. They're not just like these static, they're not resources. So they have a very different relationship to those things than I think we're, in our westernized view of nature, we don't think of as much.
Thank you for bringing that up, the indigenous practices. How would you rate New Jersey versus other states in addressing environmental justice issues?
Okay, let's do a little competitive, like I like a little healthy competition. I mean, I'd like to say, being from Jersey, that we are like the best. We're out in the front. I mean, the EJ law definitely put New Jersey back on the map as a leader in EJ. Like I would say prior to this administration, we suffered quite a bit under the last administration. We lagged for years. We started to become one of those states that was like questioning climate change. It was really embarrassing. And so we came out of that, I think, with a much bigger commitment to EJ. And honestly, New Jersey used to be, back in the day, like an innovator in, alongside California in terms of environmental regulations, mostly because we had so many environmental problems in our state. But we sort of started to lag. So I really think in the last, couple of years, we have become a real leader and innovator, and the EJ law certainly helped push that forward. And I know I have to give a lot of credit to the folks we worked with at DEP for being willing and open to really working with the EJ advocacy community in a way that we had never worked before with them like that. We had always been in a very adversarial position, even when we were working collaboratively through the NEJAC, the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the DEP. It was often very just like performative, like we're participating, we go to the meetings, but nothing would really change. Like they weren't really taking into consideration what was happening. And it was difficult. It was a very incremental relationship. And in these last few years, through the development of the EJ law, we've been able to really work on the nitty gritty of like, how do we implement these laws, like, and really hold the state agencies accountable to the commitments that they're making. So that's been a real eye opener for me. It's the first time that I've really worked so collaboratively with these regulators, right? These technicians, these folks that create these rules, and really push them, and they pushed us to figure out how to work these rules. So I think we're doing really great. I mean, obviously, there are other states that are doing great work. New York is really leading on their climate, the CLCPA, the Communities and Climate and Protection Act. I always forget the acronym, but they've set out very ambitious goals for climate mitigation, and they've done that in partnership with EJ communities as well. They've carved out significant amounts of resources for EJ communities. So they're also very much leading in terms of like the kinds of climate and energy programs that they have. And in the energy space, they're doing probably a lot better than New Jersey. We're probably lagging quite a bit when you look at the programs coming out of NYSERDA, their state agency. And then, of course, you have California. We just adopted California's truck rules. We're adopting several of the model rules that California has adopted. New Jersey is following suit. So California continues to be sort of in the lead, particularly in the transportation sector and the climate sector. So we are learning, we continue to learn from them. So there's a lot of states out there doing good work in our region, but also on the West Coast and the Midwest. We're working with a lot of folks in Minnesota, Illinois, and EJ communities are connected, like Ironbound Community Corporation and New Jersey EJ Alliance are in several national networks of EJ groups. So we're in formation across the country with other EJ groups, working on many of these issues and learning from each other and strategizing to push our states further. So that's good news.
That's great. Is there anything that like New Jersey could be doing that we're not doing? But you mentioned like, more transportation regulations and things like that to help with emissions, but is there anything else that you think could be done?
I mean, we probably need to get our act together when it comes to the ports. We have the second largest seaports in the country. and Elizabeth and Newark that have a tremendous footprint, both locally in terms of diesel, but globally in terms of, and regional in terms of goods consumption. Like, it's wild the amount of like warehousing and Amazon trucks and, just like, it's just proliferating. It's been like that in Newark for a long time, but now it's like creeping out to the whole state. And we need to like really get a handle on the logistics and goods movement sector. The EJ community for over a decade has been fighting this fight alone with groups in New York. And I think it's time that we need to like start more aggressively looking at the port sector and requiring them to, reduce their emissions and their impact on local communities. But they're regulated by the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. So it's not an easy thing to tackle, right? Because it's not just New Jersey. But then also on the energy side, like I said, I think we have a lot of work to do on the energy sector, to bring up our commitments. Like, we have some ambitious goals, but like, I don't know that we have clear the resources and the plan to get us there, right? And how equitable is it? Like, have we really taken a hard look? Equity isn't just like, oh, we're gonna have plug-in, at your apartment building for your Tesla. Like, people that, the Teslas are not gonna solve our problem. So we need to really think more creatively about what an equitable energy transition is gonna look like for New Jersey. We got a lot more work to do there, I think, for sure. I mean, I don't know, from your position, Steph, do you see, I'm sure there's things that you're hoping we would do more of in New Jersey in terms of environmental education with kids and with the Watershed Institute. So you probably have some other wish list things.
Yeah, I like how you said, I mean, I don't know how getting students involved particularly, but yeah, there's many goals out there, but I want to see the pathway to those goals. I want to see them executed as well. I want to see progress happen, and like you said, and in equitable ways as well. Yeah, being from Jersey City, sometimes, the people who are affected the most are left out of the conversation. And a lot of decisions are made, and some people are just so, I would say, like, overburdened that they can't make their way into these conversations. And I tried my hardest to be there for those reasons. But yeah, I just hope that the people in power are thinking of everyone when they're making these decisions.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So someone asked about like, where is the funding for environmental injustices that communities can go to? Most of these communities are small and underfunded, and are there some resources that can be used?
Yeah, that's a good question. Getting money is hard. You probably know, like, working at a nonprofit, it's always difficult, right, to raise funding. And I would say, like, now EJ is a lot more popular, like 10 years ago or even 15 years ago when I was working at Iron Mountain Community Corporation. It was very difficult to get funders to give you money to do EJ anything. First of all, because it was like politically, like, we don't want to touch that, like, it's too political, too contentious, or it was not seen as a priority, or like not viable, or that's too local, like that's too like in the weeds local, and that's just Newark's problem. So it was very difficult to raise money. Now I think there's been a shift in like thinking, right? And there's a lot more interest in funding environmental justice work, at least from philanthropy. Unfortunately, Dr. Nikki Sheets talks this all the time. Like, now we've made the topic so sexy that like everybody wants to do EJ, and we get out competed out of our own movement, because there are very large NGOs, environmental groups that are national, who have a lot more staff, a lot more resources. They have huge development staff, right? They have like teams of 10 people who just write grants, and we have like a staff of 3 people. So it's hard for us to compete And they'll say like, oh, we're doing environmental justice. And, a funder might not be able to distinguish the difference between like a small grassroots group doing work on the ground with residents, right, who are under resourced and under capacity versus very large institutions that have a lot of funding. And they're claiming to do EJ, right? So in the environmental justice movement, I'll say that one of the most important things are the principles of environmental justice and the HAMESH principles, and I'll put that in the chat too, is JEMEZ, HAMEZ principles for democratic organizing. And those principles remind us that people speak for themselves, right? Like the people who are most impacted, who are most directly impacted, should have the ability and the right to speak for themselves and not have people speak for them, and really be at the forefront of leading their own change in their own communities rather than people coming in from the outside. So a lot of EJ organizations are made up of people from those communities or accountable to those communities, or people of color, right, who have a lived experience. So that's really important. Representation and voice is really important. And in the funding mix, sometimes that gets lost, right? Like in the giving out of the funding. So, but I'm hopeful like that this new federal infusion of money, there's going to be like $60 billion with a B billion dollars that's earmarked to environmental justice out of the IRA package alone. And that's a really once in a generation, once in a lifetime investment that we've never seen before in environmental justice community. So we have a big responsibility in this moment to make sure that that money, those investments go to the people who need it the most and who can, use it, right? Like, so yeah, I'm very excited about this opportunity, but like, we have to hopefully do it right.
Thank you for that answer. And I think we're coming to the end of our time. And I just want to say it's been great chatting with you, Dr. Baptista. I hope to connect with you in the future. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim to, I guess, sign us off for tonight. Again, it's been a pleasure.
Steph, it was great talking to you. I feel like we got, to know each other a little bit, but I would love to be able to connect with you more and with the Watershed Institute more, to link up our work more.
Well, let me also say thank you, Dr. Baptista, for your work, for your voice, for your instruction of young people, and for your activism. The work you do is inspiring and it's so important. And Steph, thank you for the work you do. What I heard tonight was an affirmation of the importance of what you do. Years ago, the Watershed's education program was about nature and it was about science, and those are important things. But we also need to teach young people about policy and politics and how decisions are made and how they can be part of that decision-making process. And Steph, you're doing that, particularly in your work with underserved communities. And let me thank all of you for tuning in to tonight's webinar and really embracing this topic, which is so important. It's a relatively new issue for the Watershed Institute, but I'm so very proud of the work that our staff are doing and the partnerships we're building to advance these JEDI goals. And one more plug for our annual Watershed Conference that's coming up again on February 10th and 17th, 2 non-contiguous days. We're trying something a little different, and it's hybrid format, so you can come in person or you can tune in virtually, and you can register for that on our website at thewatershed.org. Last thing I need to say is the Watershed Institute is a nonprofit organization. And we obviously depend on support of people like all of you. So if you're a supporter of the Watershed, thank you very much for that support. You make our efforts possible. And if you aren't, I'll say, yet a supporter, please consider, we'd love to have you join as a member of the organization. So thanks again, Anna, for joining us. Thank you, Steph. Thanks for everyone coming out tonight. And good night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. Looking forward to staying connected.